The sky above the gray corridor was a canvas of immaculate, indifferent blue. Inside the cockpit of Viper 1, Lieutenant Evans felt less like a pilot and more like a surgeon, his gloved hands moving with sterile precision over the glowing console. His F-16, a machine of angles and edges, sliced through the thin, cold air at Mach 1.5. It was a perfect day. A boring day. "Anything on your scope?" Nomad Viper's voice was crisp, confident, the sound of a man who had never truly known failure. "Negative, Viper." "Just angels and emptiness," came the reply from his wingman. "Could fly this patrol with my eyes closed." Viper allowed himself a small, tight smile. This was the pinnacle. The seamless fusion of man and machine, a billion-dollar spear tip aimed at a silent, waiting world. Down below, hidden by the jagged peaks and lost in the haze, was Major Anya Volkov. "Mama Bear," they called her, though never to her face. She was flying her A-10 Warthog, a relic from an age of mud and iron. Her mission profile was a footnote on their briefing low-level deterrence. It was a polite way of saying, "Stay out of the way." He imagined her lumbering through the canyons, a flying tractor amidst the thoroughbreds. The thought was almost pitiable. Then the world shattered. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A sudden, violent pressure in his ears. The immaculate blue on his screen dissolved into a blizzard of static. "Warning, tracking system compromised." A high-pitched tone screamed through his helmet, a digital shriek of death. Red symbols bloomed across his heads-up display. Not one, not two, five. 5 hostile contacts appearing from nowhere as if painted onto the sky. "Viper." "I'm painted multiple locks." Nomad's voice, usually a calm baritone, was strained, cracking under the sudden G-force of a panicked brake. "Brake right. Nomad, deploy flares." Viper's commands were automatic, drilled into him by 1,000 hours in a simulator. But the simulator never replicated the cold sweat that trickled down his spine, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He threw his F-16 into a gut-wrenching turn, the force pressing him deep into his seat. He could see them now. Sleek, shark-like silhouettes, MiGs faster and more numerous. They moved like a pack of wolves, coordinated deadly. The patrol hadn't been a patrol. It had been bait. And he had led his lambs right into the slaughterhouse. The shame was a hot, suffocating blanket. This was the hook. The moment of silent, screaming humiliation. 2 hours earlier, the air in Hangar 7 had been still and cool, smelling of oil and old metal. Major Anya Volkov stood on a maintenance ladder, her hand resting on the nose of her A-10. The plane was ugly. There was no other word for it. It was a brute built around a gun, with engines awkwardly tacked on like an afterthought. Its gray paint was scarred and faded, littered with the ghosts of past repairs. The pilots of the F-16 squadron, with their slick flight suits and easy smiles, called it the Flying Pig. They saw a machine past its prime, and perhaps they saw the same in her. Anya was not like them. Her face was a map of lines, etched by sun and time, not laughter. She moved with a deliberate economy, a quiet purpose that could be mistaken for weariness. She ran a gloved finger over a row of rivets, feeling the familiar solid vibration of the airframe. This machine wasn't elegant. It didn't dance. It endured. Inside the cramped armored cockpit, the technology was archaic compared to Viper's glass displays. It was a world of analog dials, heavy switches, and worn leather. Taped to the side of the main console, yellowed and soft at the edges, was a small photograph of a smiling boy with missing front teeth, holding a model airplane. Anya's eyes lingered on it for a moment, a flicker of something deep and distant in their gray depths, before she began her pre-flight check. Her movements were a ritual, a silent conversation with the machine. She didn't trust computers to tell her everything was okay. She trusted the click of a switch, the resistance of a lever, the hum of the hydraulics coming to life. In the briefing room, she had been a ghost. Lieutenant Evans Viper had commanded the space, his pointer stick tapping authoritatively against a digital map of the gray corridor. He spoke of combat air patrols, radar envelopes, and optimal engagement altitudes. His world was a three-dimensional chessboard in the stratosphere. When the commander turned to Anya, his tone shifted. "Major, you'll be running deterrence patrol in Sector Delta. Stick to the canyons. Standard comms check every 30. Stay low, stay quiet." It was a dismissal, a babysitting assignment. The other pilots shifted in their seats, a few sharing knowing glances. Anya simply nodded, her gaze steady. "Understood, sir." She didn't mind. The canyons were where her Warthog belonged. The sleek fighters could have the clean, open sky. They could play their games of speed and light. She preferred the earth. She felt safer closer to it, where you could smell the pine on the updrafts and see the shadows of the clouds crawl across the mountainsides. She was a guardian of the ground, a protector of things that couldn't fly away. Now, flying her prescribed lonely route through a deep gorge, she heard it. A whisper of chaos on the emergency channel. Not a clear message, just fragments of sound torn apart by static. A panicked word, a high G breathing grunt, the unmistakable piercing tone of a missile lock warning. It was miles away. It was not her sector. It was not her fight. Her orders were clear: stay low, stay quiet. Her hands rested on the throttle and stick. For a long moment she just listened, her head tilted like a physician diagnosing a distant sickness. The frantic noise on the radio was the sound of young men, confident men, discovering that the sky was not a chessboard. It was an ambush alley. She looked at the photograph of the smiling boy. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that betrayed the storm of decision within her, Anya Volkov pushed the throttles forward. The A-10's twin engines spooled up with a hungry rising roar that echoed off the canyon walls. She banked the ugly, stubborn plane not away from the danger, but towards it, climbing out of the shadows and into the indifferent blue. The A-10 did not climb so much as it clawed its way upward. The machine protested the sudden demand for performance, its engines whining a guttural complaint against the thinning air. Anya felt the struggle in her bones, a familiar, stubborn vibration that ran from the stick up her arm and settled in her chest. Below her, the sheltering arms of the canyon fell away, exposing her to the vast, open emptiness of the sky. She was a target now. Slow, heavy, predictable. Everything a fighter pilot was trained to kill. The memory of the morning's briefing surfaced unbidden, as sharp and clear as the horizon line. It was a scene of contrasts, a study in two different worlds, occupying the same sterile, air-conditioned space. The main briefing room was Viper's territory. He stood before a massive tactical display, a glowing map of the gray corridor, his silhouette crisp against the blue light. He moved with the easy grace of an athlete, his voice a confident metronome marking out flight paths, radar frequencies, and rules of engagement. "Saksitaya, we maintain a combat spread of 2 nautical miles, allowing for full sensor overlap. On initial contact, Nomad flight will sweep high, drawing their fire, while my element cuts underneath to engage their 6. It will be fast. It will be clean." The young pilots of his squadron, all sharp jaws and sharper haircuts, nodded in unison. They leaned forward, absorbing his words, their energy filling the room with an almost tangible arrogance. They were the tip of the spear, and they knew it. Anya had watched from the back, seated on a folding chair near the coffee machine that always smelled faintly of burnt plastic. She was a relic in a room dedicated to the future. Her flight suit was a darker, more faded shade of green. Her notepad was paper. Her pen a simple black ballpoint. While they spoke of gigahertz and data links, she made notes on wind shear in the lower canyons and the migratory patterns of birds. Details of the earth, not the sky. Lieutenant Master's Nomad's wingman had pointed to a weather overlay showing unpredictable air currents near the ridge she was assigned to patrol. Major, he'd said, his tone not quite disrespectful, but heavy with condescension. Better keep that pig's nose into the wind. Wouldn't want you to get tossed around with the buzzards. A few of the younger men had smirked. Viper had offered a thin, dismissive smile before continuing the interruption, a momentary inconvenience. They saw her as a bus driver, a necessary but unglamorous part of the Air Force ecosystem. Anya had not reacted. She simply looked at the young lieutenant, her gaze steady until he shifted uncomfortably and looked away. She had learned long ago that silence was a language few men like him understood, and it was the only one that ever made them listen. She finished her notes, underlined the word crosswinds, and took a slow sip of her bitter coffee. Her fight was never in the briefing room. The memory dissolved, replaced by the hangar. The quiet hour after the briefing when the F-16 crews swarmed their perfect sterile jets with an almost religious fervor. Her own hangar number 7 was at the far end of the flight line. It was a cavernous, drafty space that the maintenance crews used for older equipment. It was where things were sent to be forgotten. But Anya never forgot. She had stood before the Warthog, a machine born not from a desire for elegance, but from a brutal understanding of necessity. Its skin was a patchwork of repairs, each rivet a testament to a life of hard service. She ran a bare hand along the edge of the wing, the metal cool and solid beneath her palm. It felt like shaking hands with an old friend. She trusted this plane not because it was fast, but because it was honest. It promised nothing more than to fly through hell and bring you back carrying the scars to prove it. She had climbed into the cockpit, the familiar scent of hydraulic fluid and worn upholstery enveloping her. Her first action, as always, was to gently wipe the dust from the small taped photograph with her thumb. The boy's smile was a silent anchor in her turbulent world. It was a promise she had made to herself, a debt she could never fully repay, but would spend her life trying to. It was the reason she still flew. Not for the sky, but for the people on the ground, for the ones who looked up hoping to be saved. A jolt of turbulence threw her against her straps, pulling her violently back to the present. She was clear of the mountain peaks now, and the battle was laid out before her. It was not the clean, surgical engagement Viper had described. It was a chaotic, desperate melee. The two F-16s were like silver fish darting frantically through a swarm of sharks. Flares blossomed in puffs of brilliant white, desperate attempts to fool the missiles that chased them. She could see the trails of smoke, the frantic high G turns that were bleeding the F-16s of their energy and speed. They were being herded, driven into a killing box. Viper's voice, when it cut through the radio, was almost unrecognizable. The confident commander was gone, replaced by a man gasping for air, his words clipped and ragged. "Nomad, I can't shake him, he's on my 6, break. Anya watched the unfolding chaos, but her mind was calm. She did not see the terror. She saw the geometry of the problem. She saw the patterns in the predator's attack. They were arrogant, overextended, focused entirely on their panicked prey. They did not look down. They never did. Her thumb moved from the throttle to the master arm switch. A heavy, satisfying clunk echoed through the cockpit. On her panel, a series of lights switched from a passive white to a predatory green. Mama Bear was no longer watching. She was hunting. Desperation was a physical thing. It was the burning in Viper's lungs as he fought for every breath against the crushing G-forces. It was the frantic, useless dance his eyes performed across the instrument panel, searching for a solution that his technology could no longer provide. His F-16, a machine designed for elegant lethality, was reduced to a cornered animal. The lead MiG was a parasite glued to his tail, its position unwavering, its pilot patient. The missile lock tone was no longer a warning. It was a death sentence counting down the final seconds of his life. He could see Nomad's aircraft Viper II caught in a similar deadly embrace. Flares and chaff were blooming behind them, beautiful, pathetic clouds of hope against an indifferent sky. They had done everything by the book. They had executed every maneuver they had ever been taught. And the book was wrong. The lessons were useless. The sky was not a place of rules, it was a place of brutal truths, and the truth was, they were about to die. He braced for the impact, a strange sense of calm washing over him, the final quiet acceptance of the inevitable. And then the sky tore open. It was not a sound his ears registered at first, but a vibration that resonated through the very structure of his aircraft. It was a deep, guttural, violent roar that seemed to come from the throat of the world itself. A sound of canvas being ripped 1 billion times a second. BRRRRT! Viper's eyes snapped forward. The MiG on his tail, the one that had been his entire world for the last 60 seconds, simply ceased to exist. It did not explode in a ball of fire. It was unmade. One moment it was a sleek, deadly machine of war. The next it was a cloud of glittering, vaporized metal, a puff of aluminum confetti that his F-16 flew through without a shudder. The missile lock tone died with an abrupt electronic gasp. His mind struggled to process the event. Had the MiG's weapon misfired? Had its engine disintegrated? He risked a glance over his shoulder, his body screaming in protest. That was when he saw it. Climbing slowly, deliberately from the canyons below was the A-10, the flying pig. It looked less like an aircraft and more like a tool of brutalist architecture, all hard angles and function over form. It was not flying through the battle so much as it was plowing through it, an unstoppable armored fist against a storm of scalpels. Its nose, built around the 7 barrels of its monstrous cannon, was pointed at another of the MiGs, the one tormenting Nomad. From Anya's perspective, there was no panic. There was only the cold calculus of the hunt. Her world was compressed to the glowing green circle of her targeting reticle. The high-speed dogfight above had looked like chaos, but from her slower, lower vantage point, it was a predictable pattern. The MiGs were arrogant, their turns wide and confident as they toyed with their prey. They had forgotten the world below them. A fatal mistake. She had lined up the shot, her inputs on the stick smooth and minimal. She didn't need a sophisticated computer to tell her where to aim. She had been doing this for 30 years. She could feel the trajectory in her hands in the subtle feedback of the airframe. The MiG drifted perfectly into her sights. Her thumb depressed the trigger on her control stick. The entire Warthog shuddered around her, a beast recoiling from the force of its own bite. For 2 seconds, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon unleashed a torrent of 30mm armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The cockpit filled with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt propellant. Through her HUD, she watched the stream of tracers, a solid line of incandescent fury, connect with the enemy aircraft. The target vanished. Problem solved. She released the trigger. The violent shuddering stopped. She was already scanning for the next target, her eyes tracing the lines of the battle, prioritizing threats, dismantling the enemy's perfect ambush one piece at a time. This was her element. Not the clean, sterile world of beyond visual range combat, but the gritty knife-fight reality of guns and steel. The radio, which had been a cacophony of panicked shouts and alarms, had fallen eerily silent. The remaining MiGs, their formation broken, their confidence shattered by the sudden violent loss of two of their pack, circled uncertainly. The F-16 pilots their lives inexplicably handed back to them were equally stunned into silence. Into this vacuum of sound, Anya keyed her microphone. Her voice, when it came, was not the adrenaline-fueled shout of a warrior. It was calm, level, almost weary, like a mother who had just broken up a fight in the schoolyard. "Viper, this is Mama Bear. I suggest you get the kids back on the porch. It's starting to get dark out." The transmission ended. For a long moment, the only sound in Viper's helmet was his own ragged breathing. He stared at the ugly, scarred shape of the A-10 as it banked slowly, placing itself between his surviving jets and the confused enemy. The call sign he and his men had used as a private joke, a term of derision for the old woman and her flying tractor, had just been redefined. It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of fact. And he was one of the children she had just saved from the wolves. For a moment after Anya's transmission, a stunned truce held the sky. Viper and Nomad circled high above their movements, tentative, their roles suddenly and completely inverted. They were no longer the hunters, not even the prey. They were spectators. Below them, the three remaining MiGs had regrouped their tight, aggressive formation, now loose and uncertain. Confusion was a more potent enemy than any missile. Then confusion curdled into rage. These were elite pilots, the pride of their air force, and they had been humiliated by a slow, outdated ground attack jet. Professional pride, a force more powerful than any strategic objective, took over. The lead MiG pilot, his voice a furious snarl over an open channel intended to intimidate, gave the order. They broke formation and dived not in a coordinated attack, but in a vengeful, predatory plunge. They were going to erase this anomaly from the sky. Viper's instinct screamed for him to dive as well, to help to do something. But Anya's voice came over the radio again, and this time it was not weary, but cold and hard as iron. "Viper, you stay high. Keep your eyes open. This is not your fight." Then, to his utter astonishment, she did not try to meet their charge or climb for altitude. She did the opposite. She pushed the stick forward, and the A-10 Warthog plunged back towards the earth, disappearing into the labyrinth of canyons from which she had emerged. To the MiGs, it must have looked like a retreat, a desperate act of cowardice. To Viper, it looked like suicide. But as Anya descended, the claustrophobic rush of the canyon walls closing in around her felt like coming home. The shadows embraced her aircraft, the turbulent air a familiar language. This was not a retreat. It was an invitation. The way the light died, replaced by streaks of gray rock and deep shadow, was a cold hand of a memory reaching across the years. Another sky. Another time. The air thick with smoke and the metallic taste of fear. Her brother's voice, young and frantic over the radio, laced with static. "Anya, I'm hit, engines failing, I can't hold altitude." His F-111, a marvel of advanced technology, was trailing black smoke. They were over open desert, flat and endless. Nowhere to hide. She had been in her A-10 pinned down by ground fire, screaming for him to turn towards the mountains just a few miles away. "Get low, Dmitri. Use the terrain. I can't cover you out there." "No time, I'm going to outrun them," he had shouted back, his pilot's pride overriding his fear. It was a fatal mistake. Speed was a lie when you were wounded. She watched on her screen as two enemy fighters closed the distance with sickening ease. There was a flash of light, and Dmitri's voice, his call sign, Robin, dissolved into a final, hopeless burst of static. Not this time, Anya whispered to the ghost in her cockpit. This time they would fight in her world. The lead MiG screamed into the canyon behind her, a silver dart in the gloom. Its pilot was supremely confident, his superior speed an undeniable advantage. He closed the distance in seconds, preparing for a simple, satisfying gun kill. But the canyon was not a straight line. Anya banked the A-10 hard, a maneuver that should have been impossible for a plane its size. The Warthog groaned, but it held its wide wings, gripping the turbulent air. She scraped past a granite rock face, the sound of her wingtip kissing the stone, a screech of protest that vibrated through the cockpit. The MiG pilot, committed to his high speed, could not match the turn. He overshot, roaring past her in a blur. For a single fatal second, his aircraft filled her windscreen. It was all she needed. She didn't even use the cannon. She selected a heat-seeking missile, got an instant tone lock on his exposed engine exhaust, and fired. The missile shot off the rail with a whoosh, a short, vicious little jab that crossed the 100 meters between them in a heartbeat. The MiG erupted in a blossom of orange and black, its wreckage tumbling into the canyon floor below. High above, Viper felt his jaw go slack. "Did you see that? My God." He flew right into her trap. Nomad breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. The remaining two MiGs, now seeing the canyon for what it was, a tomb, tried to climb out. But Anya was already turning her engines at full power, using her slower speed to pivot almost in place. She met the second MiG as it tried to claw for the open sky. This time she used the gun. The BRRRRT was different down here. Trapped between the rock walls, the sound did not dissipate. It was magnified, an apocalyptic, echoing roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. The MiG pilot had nowhere to evade. The stream of 30mm rounds tore his aircraft in half. The last MiG pilot, seeing his wingman disintegrated before his eyes, gave up the fight. He firewalled his throttle and fled, a silver streak rocketing away from the haunted canyons, leaving the battle to the ghost who ruled them. The sky fell silent once more. All that remained was the steady drone of Anya's engines. She leveled her wings, her breathing slow and even. She flew for another minute, her knuckles white on the control stick, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind the cold, familiar ache of memory. The victory was not sweet. It was a somber, silent closing of a wound that had wept for 2 decades. Her gaze fell to the photograph of the smiling boy taped to her console. "This time, Robin, I brought you home." The silence that followed the final MiG's panicked retreat was more profound than the roar of the battle it replaced. It was a heavy, ringing quiet that filled Viper's cockpit, broken only by the hum of his own systems and the ragged sound of his breathing. The sky, moments before a canvas of smoke trails and deadly trajectories, was once again an expanse of indifferent blue. Below, the canyons were silent, having swallowed the wreckage of 2 advanced fighters, their secrets now kept by ancient stone. Viper and Nomad circled aimlessly, 2 silver sharks who had forgotten how to hunt. They were adrift, their purpose, their entire tactical doctrine rendered meaningless by what they had just witnessed. They were survivors, but they did not feel victorious. They felt humbled. Anya's voice over the radio cut through his thoughts. It was devoid of the iron-hard edge from the fight, now just matter-of-fact tired. "Viper, Nomad. Damage report." Nomad was the first to answer, his voice shaky. "Systems green. No structural damage." I'm fine." Viper took a moment longer. He ran a diagnostic, his hands moving automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of the MiG that had simply been unmade before his eyes. "Viper 1 is green. No damage." He paused, the next words feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. "Thank you, Mama Bear. You saved our lives?" There was a moment of static. Anya's reply was clipped, deflecting the sentimentality. A debrief is for the ground. Viper, form up on my wing. Nomad on my other side. We're going home. The command was a quiet earthquake in the established order of things. An A-10 did not lead a formation of F-16s. A ground pounder did not give orders to the kings of the sky. Every instinct, every hour of training Viper had ever received screamed at him to take his rightful place at the head of the formation. His pride, already in tatters, made a final, desperate stand. He looked down at the Warthog as it began a slow, wide turn toward home. He saw the rugged, unyielding shape of it, and he remembered her voice from the canyon, calm, lethal, and utterly in control. He remembered his own voice, panicked and helpless. The battle in his mind lasted only a second, and it was no contest. Pride was a luxury for men who had not just been pulled from their own graves. Copy Mama Bear Viper said the words, tasting of humility. Viper flight is forming on your wing. He guided his F-16 into position just off her right. The proximity felt unnatural. From this close, he could see the details of the A-10 he had never bothered to notice before. He saw the patched-up panels from old battles, the streaks of soot behind the cannon's muzzle, the way the cockpit was encased in a thick shell of armor that he now understood was a design of profound wisdom. He saw a fresh, angry gash along the top of her fuselage, a wound from the canyon wall. She had been willing to damage her own aircraft to trade paint with a mountain, just to gain a tactical edge. It was a level of raw physical commitment to a fight that he had only ever read about. The flight back to base was the longest and quietest of his career. The 3 aircraft flew in a strange, solemn procession. The 2 most advanced fighters in the inventory acting as honor guards for the ugliest, slowest plane on the base. It was a formation that defied logic, a flying monument to the day's impossible events. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. The control tower, having heard the initial frantic calls of an ambush, had scrambled emergency crews. The rest of Viper's squadron, grounded by the incident, had gathered near the flight line, their faces grim, expecting to see only one of their own return, if any. They saw 3. First, they saw the unfamiliar formation, and a wave of confusion spread through the onlookers. Then, they recognized the planes. The silence was absolute as the A-10, scarred and soot-stained, led the way in for landing. It touched down with a heavy, ungraceful thud, its landing gear absorbing the impact with the resilience of a farm tractor. Then came the 2 F-16s, their landings pristine, almost delicate by comparison. Viper taxied past the line of his squadron mates. He saw their faces, the shock, the disbelief. The smirks and condescending jokes from the morning's briefing were gone, replaced by a wide-eyed, questioning awe. They were not looking at him, their celebrated flight lead. Their gaze was fixed on the Warthog as it lumbered toward its forgotten hangar at the edge of the field. Anya brought her plane to a stop and began the shutdown sequence. The twin engines spooled down with a final dying whine. In the sudden quiet, the entire airbase seemed to be holding its breath. Viper stopped his own jet on the taxiway, his orders forgotten. He just watched her. He could see her silhouette in the cockpit, her movements methodical, professional. She did not look at him. She did not look at the crowd. Her work was done. The other pilots just stood there, a silent line of men in green flight suits. Their world of clean lines, high speeds, and digital perfection utterly shattered. They were staring at a machine they had dismissed as a joke, and for the first time they were seeing it for what it truly was, a warrior. The whine of the A-10's engines faded into a profound silence, leaving Anya alone in the metallic quiet of her cockpit. For a long moment, she did not move. She simply sat, her hands resting on the controls, her gaze fixed on the worn photograph taped to the console. The world outside could wait. This quiet ritual was hers alone, a silent communion with the ghost she flew for. Finally, with a slow, weary sigh, she began the post-flight shutdown sequence, each flip of a switch, a deliberate final act. When she finally unlatched the canopy, the late afternoon air that flooded the cockpit was thick with tension. The usual business of the flight line had ceased. Ground crews stood in silent clusters, their expressions a mixture of awe and apprehension. The crew chief who approached her ladder did so with a new, unfamiliar hesitation. "Major?" He said, his voice low, his eyes avoiding hers as he looked at the fresh gash on the fuselage. "Welcome back." It was what he always said, but today the words carried a different weight. Anya simply nodded her face, an unreadable mask, and descended the ladder. Before her boots had even settled on the tarmac, a young, severe-looking officer from the command building met her. He did not offer congratulations. He did not ask if she was all right. "Major Volkov," he stated, his voice flat and official. "Colonel Matheson wants to see you in his office. Immediately. You'll come with me." It was not a request. It was a summons. This was not going to be a standard debrief. She was not a hero to be celebrated. She was a problem to be solved. The walk across the airbase was a study in silence. Pilots and ground crew alike stopped what they were doing to watch her pass, escorted like a prisoner. The smirks and whispers that usually followed the old A-10 pilot were gone, replaced by a tense, questioning quiet. She felt their eyes on her back, but her gaze never wavered from the path ahead. Colonel Matheson's office was on the top floor, a cold, immaculate room with a panoramic window that overlooked the entire base. He was a man who liked to observe his domain. He stood behind a large mahogany desk, his posture rigid, his face set like granite. Viper and Nomad were already there, standing stiffly at attention in a corner. They looked like schoolboys called to the principal's office, their earlier adrenaline replaced by a grim anxiety. Major Matheson began, his voice devoid of warmth. He did not ask her to sit. "I have read the preliminary report. I have heard Lieutenant Evans's enthusiastic account. Now I want to hear it from you. Did you or did you not abandon your assigned patrol sector in direct violation of a standing order?" "Yes, sir," Anya replied, her voice even. "And did you or did you not engage hostile aircraft inside the Gray Corridor, a designated de-escalation zone, without command authorization?" "That is correct, sir." Matheson stared at her, his jaw tightening. He was expecting a defense, a justification, an excuse. He was met with the quiet, unyielding wall of fact. "And can you offer me one single reason why I shouldn't have you court-martialed for jeopardizing the entire strategic stability of this region?" Before Anya could answer, Viper stepped forward. "Sir, if I may. Major Volkov saved my life. She saved my entire flight. The enemy ambushed us with superior numbers and advanced jamming tech. We were dead. Her actions, whatever the protocol, were the only reason we are standing here right now." Matheson's gaze snapped to Viper, his eyes cold. "Your gratitude is noted, Lieutenant. Your job is to fly your plane. My job is to prevent a war. Sit down and be silent." He turned back to Anya. "I am still waiting for an answer, Major." Anya met his gaze without flinching. "No, sir. I have no reason to offer." The colonel's frustration was palpable. He was a man who operated on rules and reports, and this woman fit into none of his boxes. He turned to his desk and pressed a button on his console. "Perhaps this will speak for you." The large screen on the wall flickered to life. It was her gun camera footage. The room was plunged into the grainy green and black world of the canyon. They watched in stark silence as the A-10 performed the impossible turn. They saw the MiG overshoot, its sleek form filling the screen for a heartbeat before the missile struck. They witnessed the second MiG's desperate climb, and then they heard it. The sound, even through the office speakers, was terrifyingly visceral. The BRRRRT of the Avenger cannon echoed in the quiet room, and they watched as the enemy aircraft was shredded into nothing. The footage ended. The screen went black. No one spoke. Viper and Nomad stared, having now seen the fight from the Predator's point of view. Colonel Matheson, his face pale, slowly sat down in his chair. He looked from the blank screen to the woman standing before him. He saw the weary lines on her face, the faded flight suit, the quiet resignation in her posture. And he saw the pilot from the video, a warrior of impossible brutal skill. The two realities did not compute. He steepled his fingers, his gaze intense, searching. "I have been your commanding officer for 2 years, Major. I have read your file. It says you are a competent, if unremarkable, ground support pilot with a clean record. It says you are 2 months from retirement." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "That file is a lie. Who are you?" Anya remained silent. Her mission was over. The boys were home. Nothing else mattered. Matheson held her gaze for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "You are grounded, effective, immediately pending a full inquiry. You are not to leave this base. You are not to speak to anyone about this engagement. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," she said. Dismissed. As Anya turned and walked out of the office, the colonel swiveled his chair to his computer. He pulled up his secure terminal and typed in a request. His voice, when he spoke into his comms link, was firm. "This is Colonel Matheson. I need a file unlocked. Authorization code Alpha Gamma 72. I want the complete unredacted service record for Major Anya Volkov. Yes, the one from Project Chimera. The sealed one." Night fell on the airbase, draping it in a blanket of cool, quiet darkness. In his office, Colonel Matheson was alone, the only light coming from the green glow of his secure monitor. The rest of the base slept or tried to the day's events, replaying in the minds of the F-16 pilots. But for Matheson, the day was far from over. An encrypted file had arrived, its digital wrapper flashing with warnings: "Top secret, eyes only, Project Chimera." He took a deep breath, a man about to open a tomb, and clicked the file. The first thing that loaded was a photograph. It was Anya Volkov, but at the same time, it was not. The woman on the screen was younger, her jaw set with a hard, uncompromising fire, her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. There was no weariness in that face, only a chilling intensity. Her name was the same, but her call sign was different. It was not the gentle, maternal Mama Bear. It was Spectre. As Matheson scrolled a career he never knew existed unfolded before him. Commendations for valor after action reports from Black Ops missions in countries that officially the Air Force had never been to. The file spoke of a pilot with an almost supernatural talent for low-level flying, a master of using terrain as both a weapon and a shield. It was filled with phrases like unflinching under heavy fire, unparalleled situational awareness, and lethally effective. This was the pilot from the gun camera footage. This was the woman who had danced with mountains and executed MiGs with cold precision. Miles away in the cavernous silence of Hangar 7, Anya stood in the dark, her hand resting on the cold skin of her Warthog. The ground crew had long since gone home, leaving her to the company of her machine and her ghosts. She gently traced the new scar the canyon had gifted her fuselage. The anger of the battle had faded, the adrenaline was gone, and all that remained was the hollow, familiar ache. She wasn't thinking of the pilots she had shot down or the ones she had saved. She was thinking of the one she had not. "Did I do right by you this time, Dmitri?" the thought whispered in the quiet of her mind. "I saved them." but the cost. The cost was this feeling, this resurrection of the person she had tried so hard to bury. The specter was awake again, and Anya did not know if she could survive her. Back in the office, Matheson had reached the heart of the file, a single heavily redacted mission folder titled Operation Sundown. The objective had been to provide close air support for a special forces team deep in hostile territory. The unit assigned was an elite experimental A-10 squadron call sign Chimera. Spectre was the flight lead. He clicked on the combat transcript, and the clinical official language gave way to the raw chaos of battle. They had flown into a sophisticated trap, an integrated air defense system no one had seen coming. One by one, he read the call signs as they went silent. Chimera 3 is hit, I'm going down. Mayday, Mayday, Chimera 4 is gone. He scanned the roster, his blood running cold, as he found the name of her wingman, First Lieutenant Dmitry Robin Volkov, her brother. He read her voice in the transcript, no longer the calm commander, but a desperate sister. Robin, break for the mountains, get low, damn it. And he read Dmitry's final, prideful transmission, a chilling echo of what Viper might have said. Negative Spectre, I can outrun them. The next line in the transcript was simple, brutal, and final. As Matheson read those words, Anya flinched in the darkness of the hangar, a sudden sharp intake of breath. The memory was not a thought. It was a physical assault. The brilliant flash against the desert sky. The blossoming fireball where her brother's plane used to be. The deafening, absolute silence on the radio where his voice should have been. The feeling of being utterly, completely alone, the sole survivor in a sky full of fire and death. The final section of the file was a series of psychological evaluations. Matheson read the clinical dissection of a shattered soul. Acute combat trauma. Severe survivor's guilt. Displays a dangerous fixation on the loss of her wingman and brother. The recommendation was stark. While Major Volkov's skills remain exceptional, she is deemed psychologically unfit for high-stress air combat command. Her decisive, aggressive instincts, once an asset, now present a risk of reckless self-sacrifice. Matheson finally understood. They hadn't grounded her for a lack of skill. They had grounded her because her spirit was broken. They had taken away Spectre, the call sign she had earned in fire, and given her Mama Bear, a name meant to pacify, to domesticate. They had hidden one of their most lethal warriors in plain sight, assigning her to low-risk patrols in a quiet sector, hoping she would fade away into retirement without ever having to face the storm again. But the storm had found her, and the Spectre had refused to stay buried. He closed the file, the screen going dark, plunging the office into shadow. He stood up and walked to the panoramic window, looking out across the sleeping base toward the dim, lonely light of Hangar 7. The disciplinary issue had vanished, replaced by a far more complex and dangerous reality. The woman down there was not a disobedient subordinate. She was a legend, a tragedy, and a weapon all rolled into one. And he, Colonel Matheson, had absolutely no idea what to do with her. Dawn bled across the horizon, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of soft gray and rose. But for Lieutenant Viper Evans, the night had never ended. He was in the simulator, the clammy recycled air smelling of plastic and ozone. The canopy was down, the world outside banished. On the wraparound screens, the jagged peaks of the gray corridor were rendered in perfect, sterile detail. He wasn't flying his F-16. He had programmed the scenario from the day before, but he had chosen a different aircraft. He was flying the A-10. He felt the sluggishness of the controls, the agonizingly slow climb rate. The simulator perfectly replicated the physics, but it could not replicate the soul of the machine or the will of the woman who flew it. He tried to follow her path, diving into the canyons. He crashed within 30 seconds. He reset the simulation. He crashed again. He could not comprehend how she had done it, how she had made this lumbering beast dance between walls of rock while fighting for her life. The simulation was a ghost of the battle, and even that was more than he could handle. He finally emerged from the simulator hours later, his flight suit damp with sweat, his eyes gritty from lack of sleep. He walked into the squadron's ready room, and the atmosphere that hit him was entirely alien. The usual morning bravado, the loud jokes, and easy confidence were gone. In their place was a thick, somber quiet. Pilots spoke in hushed tones, nursing mugs of coffee, their eyes distant. They all looked up as he entered. They were not looking at their hotshot flight lead anymore. They were looking at a man who had walked through the fire and come back changed. Lieutenant Masters. The pilot who had made the joke about the buzzards approached him. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by a look of genuine, troubled humility. Viper. Alex, he began, stumbling over the words. We heard the comms chatter. Jesus, what was it like? Viper looked at the faces of his men. These elite pilots who 24 hours ago believed themselves to be invincible. He thought of the simulator of his repeated pathetic failures to replicate what Anya had done as a matter of instinct. We were taught how to have a duel. Viper said, his voice low and raspy. Yesterday she taught me how to fight. He left the statement hanging in the quiet room and walked away, needing to find the source of his obsession. He found her predictably in Hangar 7. The Warthog was surrounded by maintenance platforms, a team of specialists examining the damage. And in the middle of it all was Anya, not watching from the sidelines, but on a ladder herself, pointing out a series of small punctures on the underside of a wing to a crew chief. She was in a simple pair of coveralls, her hands stained with grease. She was a part of the machine's recovery, not just its pilot. He waited until she was on the ground, his presence awkward and intrusive in her world of focused work. She saw him, and her face registered nothing, but she stopped what she was doing. Lieutenant, she acknowledged, her tone neutral. Major, he began the word thanks, feeling ridiculously small, an insult to the scale of the debt he owed. The report is filed. I made it clear that without your intervention, The report will say what it says, she interrupted, cutting off his attempt at a formal speech. She turned to pick up a wrench, her message clear, the conversation was over. That maneuver in the canyon, Viper pressed on, refusing to be dismissed. Scraping the wall to force the overshoot. I've run it on the sim a dozen times. It's impossible. It's not in any manual. It's not a recognized tactic. Anya stopped. She put the wrench down and finally looked at him. Really looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but for a moment he saw a flicker of the specter in their depths. The manual is for when things go right, Lieutenant. She said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades. It's useless for when they don't. He felt the truth of that statement settle deep in his bones. His entire career had been built on following the manual. Why did you do it? He asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. You broke every rule. They could take your wings for this. Why for us? Anya's gaze drifted past him toward the scarred nose of her plane, toward the memory of another pilot, another sky. Her expression was distant, pained. Because I have been in a sky full of ghosts, before she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wasn't going to let them have any more. With that, she turned and climbed back up the ladder, her back to him. The wall was back up. But he had seen through the crack. He understood then that her actions had not been for him, not really. He and Nomad were just proxies in a much older, much more personal war she was fighting. He had simply been a chance for her to finally win a battle she had lost long ago. He stood there for another minute, watching her work. Then he turned and walked away, a profound and permanent shift in his soul. He did not feel like a pilot who had been saved. He felt like a boy who had just been granted a glimpse into the heart of a true warrior. And it was a sight he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The fragile peace on the airbase lasted less than 48 hours. While the pilots of Viper's squadron were recalibrating their understanding of courage and Colonel Matheson was wrestling with the ghost in Anya Volkov's file, the geopolitical world was catching up. The incident in the Gray Corridor had not been a quiet affair. Wreckage had been found. Satellites had seen things. And now the consequences were arriving. It came in the form of a Priority 1 encrypted video call from command headquarters. Matheson accepted it in the soundproofed confines of his office. The face that appeared on the screen was that of General Thornton, a man whose military career had been forged not in the cockpit, but in the halls of power. His expression was one of controlled, icy fury. Colonel Thornton began dispensing with pleasantries. "I have spent the last 12 hours in damage control with the State Department. The foreign ministry of the opposing power has lodged a formal and very public protest. They claim one of our patrols staged an unprovoked attack on their aircraft in a de-escalation zone. They have pieces of their most advanced fighter jet to prove it. The media is starting to pick it up. This is turning into a strategic nightmare." Matheson stood his ground. "General, my pilots were ambushed. The enemy initiated contact with overwhelming force and hostile intent. We have the F-16 flight recorder data to prove it, and Major Volkov's gun camera footage is undeniable." Thornton waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away an inconvenient fly. "Your pilots' recorders were compromised by jamming, and their footage shows nothing but static and panic. Volkov's footage shows her destroying 2 of their aircraft. You see evidence. I see a political weapon they are using against us. They are painting a picture of a rogue American pilot indiscriminately shooting down their peacekeepers." "That is a lie," General Matheson said, his voice dangerously level. "The truth is no longer the point," Colonel Thornton snapped back. "Perception is the point. And right now, we are losing. I need to give the diplomats something to work with. I need a solution. The preliminary report says this Major Volkov acted alone in direct violation of your orders." The general's eyes narrowed. "Tell me about her." Matheson knew he was walking on a razor's edge. He could not reveal the contents of a sealed file, but he could not let them sacrifice her. "She is one of my most experienced pilots, General. She saved the lives of 2 of our men. She's a ground attack pilot on the verge of retirement, who, according to this report, somehow outmaneuvered and destroyed 2 fourth-generation air superiority fighters. It's not a believable story, Matheson. It sounds like a cover for a black operation. The brass wants to de-escalate. They want a simple, clean narrative. A disobedient pilot who lost control, took matters into her own hands, and will be disciplined accordingly. A quiet court-martial, a dishonorable discharge. It would go a long way to smoothing things over." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. A scapegoat. They wanted to take a genuine act of heroism and twist it into a crime, all for the sake of political convenience. The system wasn't just indifferent. It was predatory. General Matheson said, making his choice. "That is not a solution I am willing to consider. Major Volkov is a hero. If command wants to discipline someone, they can start with me for failing to anticipate the ambush." Thornton's face hardened. "Be careful, Colonel. Loyalty is a fine quality until it becomes insubordination. I am giving you one last chance. You will conduct a full inquiry, and you will find a way to place the blame squarely on your pilot. Give me her career on a platter, or I will have yours. Do you understand me?" The line went dead, leaving Matheson alone in the crushing silence of his office. He had just been ordered to crucify one of his own. Meanwhile, Anya was grounded. Her world, once as vast as the sky, had shrunk to the confines of the base. She was a ghost in her own life, watching others perform the duties that had defined her. From the window of her Spartan quarters, she watched Viper's flight take off for the morning patrol. The F-16s climbed into the sky with a roar of afterburners, sleek and perfect. She watched them go until they were nothing but silver specks in the distance. She felt a strange sense of detachment. She was not angry. She was not surprised. She had seen this before. She knew how the great machine worked. It demanded sacrifices, and it did not care if those sacrifices were just. She had thrown herself into the gears to save Dmitri, and it had broken her. Now she had done it again to save Viper and Nomad. The machine would grind her down just the same. She turned away from the window. There was paperwork to be filled out, her official statement of events. She picked up a pen and began to write her words as clean and emotionless as a technical manual. She would give them the facts. She would accept the consequences. It was the price she had always known she would have to pay. The airbase had settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. The official story disseminated in clipped formal briefings was that the incident in the gray corridor was under investigation. The phrase was a bureaucratic wall designed to halt questions and enforce silence. But silence could not stop the truth from spreading. Every pilot in Viper's squadron knew what had happened, and their quiet, transformed respect for Anya Volkov was a palpable force in every room they entered. For Viper, this passive respect was not enough. It felt like a betrayal. He watched as Anya was confined to administrative duties, a warrior forced to file paperwork, while the sky she owned was patrolled by others. He saw the cold official glances directed her way from the command staff. He heard the whispers of a high-level inquiry of pressure coming down from the top. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they were building a cage for her. The system that had failed to protect him in the air was now preparing to devour the one who had. His new view of the world, a view forged in the heart of a canyon and baptized by the fire of an A-10's cannon, would not allow him to stand by and watch. The manual he had lived by was useless here. This was a matter of conscience. The decision came to him late one night alone in his quarters. The official report he had filed was factually accurate but emotionally sterile. It did not and could not capture the soul of the event, the sheer abject terror of the ambush, and the sublime, terrifying grace of their salvation. He needed to tell the real story, and he knew the chain of command would bury it. He sat down at his secure laptop, his heart pounding with a nervous energy that felt more real than the thrill of flying. He began to write not a report, but a letter. The recipient was a man who existed outside the politics of the current command structure, his father, retired General Marcus Evans, a man whose name still commanded immense respect in the corridors of the Pentagon. He wrote for hours. He described the perfection of the trap, the failure of their technology, the certainty of their deaths. He attached his own helmet cam footage, a chaotic, static-filled recording of his own panic. Then he attached Anya's footage, a clean, cold, methodical record of her lethal artistry. He didn't just describe what she did. He tried with clumsy, inadequate words to explain how she did it. He wrote of her instinct, her courage, her absolute mastery of a kind of warfare he now realized was a dying art form. He concluded with a final career-risking plea. They are trying to turn this into a story about a rogue pilot. The truth is, this is a story about a warrior who reminded us what that word even means. She upheld the highest honor of the service. She left no one behind. If the Air Force punishes her for that, then the honor we claim to serve is a lie. He read it over one last time, his finger hovering over the send key. This was an act of profound insubordination, a betrayal of the very system he had sworn to uphold. But standing by while Anya was sacrificed would be a betrayal of himself. He hit send. The encrypted file vanished into the ether. There was no going back. At the same time, in his office, Colonel Matheson was staging his own quiet rebellion. General Thornton's ultimatum, Anya's career for his, sat on his conscience like a lead weight. He had spent his life serving the chain of command, believing in its integrity. That belief was now shattered. He pulled up the formal inquiry request on his monitor. He was supposed to be building a case against Anya. Instead, he began to build her defense. He attached his own formal recommendation to the file, a document that would send shockwaves up the command chain. In it, he did not recommend a court-martial. He recommended the Distinguished Flying Cross. He went further. He officially reclassified the entire engagement, including Anya's footage under the codename Operation Sundown Datiuntundi, linking it directly to the tragic sealed events of her past. This made the footage and her history an inseparable part of the official record, making it nearly impossible for the politicians to isolate and spin the recent incident. Finally, he wrote his own response to General Thornton. It was respectful, formal, and utterly defiant. It stated that his investigation had found that the near loss of Viper's flight was due to a catastrophic intelligence failure at the strategic level, which had failed to detect the enemy's new jamming capabilities. He was shifting the blame from the pilot to the system. He was pointing the gun back up the chain of command. Both men, the young pilot and the veteran commander, acted alone, unaware of the other's defiance. They had become the unwitting shields for a woman who had shielded them first. In the quiet darkness of the airbase, two separate acts of integrity had been set in motion, two vectors of truth aimed directly at the heart of the great machine. A collision was now inevitable. The ripples from Colonel Matheson's and Lieutenant Evans's stones of defiance did not take long to reach the distant, still waters of the Pentagon. In a soundproofed, sterile briefing room buried deep within the building's rings, General Thornton found himself on the defensive. The simple, clean narrative he had intended to build was already unraveling. On the screen before him were the faces of an Undersecretary of Defense and a senior diplomat from the State Department. Their expressions were impatient, their time measured in geopolitical crises. "Give me an update, General," the Undersecretary said, his voice flat. "This incident in the Gray Corridor is holding up the treaty negotiations. The other side is screaming about an unprovoked attack. What is our official response?" Thornton cleared his throat, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. "We are finalizing our inquiry. The facts point to a clear violation of protocol by a single pilot, Major Anya Volkov. We are preparing to take appropriate disciplinary action." The diplomat sighed, a sound of pure, condescending frustration. "That's not going to be enough. Not anymore." General Marcus Evans made a personal call to the Secretary of the Air Force this morning, a friendly inquiry on behalf of his son. He let the name hang in the air. General Evans was retired, but his shadow was long, his reputation impeccable. He spoke of a pilot named Volkov, who performed an act of legendary heroism. His words. "It seems your simple narrative is already being contradicted by a rather powerful source." Thornton felt a flush of anger. Viper's letter had struck its target. Before he could respond, the Undersecretary spoke again. "I've also reviewed the official report from your commander on the scene, Colonel Matheson. He seems to agree with General Evans. He's recommending a medal for this Major Volkov, not a court-martial. He also makes some rather bold claims about an intelligence failure within your own command." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "So who is lying, General, your command on the ground, or you?" Thornton was cornered. His authority was being questioned, his control over the situation eroding with every word. He had no choice but to deploy his final, most dangerous piece of information, the very one Matheson had used to shield Anya. Gentlemen, Thornton began, his tone shifting. This situation is more complex than it appears. Colonel Matheson's report invoked a sealed classification, Operation Sundown 2. To understand his recommendation and the Major's actions, you need to see the original file. With a few keystrokes, he authorized the unsealing of Project Chimera. He transmitted the file to their secure terminals. For several minutes, the only sound in the virtual conference room was the quiet hiss of the encrypted connection. Then a profound, sober silence took hold. The politicians and generals' men, accustomed to dealing in statistics and strategies, were now reading a story of blood and fire. They read the file of Spectre, the legendary A-10 pilot. They saw the commendations from forgotten battlefields. They read the stark, brutal after-action report of Operation Sundown, the one that detailed the loss of an entire squadron. They saw the name of her brother, Dmitry Robin Volkov, listed among the dead. And they read the final damning psychological report that had buried her alive in a quiet, dead-end assignment. The diplomat was the first to speak, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "My God," he whispered. "She's the sole survivor of the Chimera disaster." The undersecretary looked up from the file, his face pale. "We sent her back into the same nightmare, an ambush superior enemy tech. It's the exact same scenario, and this time she won." Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. General Evans's intervention was not just a father protecting his son. It was a warrior defending one of their own. Colonel Matheson's defiance was not insubordination. It was an act of profound moral courage. And Anya Volkov's actions were not those of a rogue pilot. They were an act of redemption 20 years in the making. The plan to sacrifice her was not just politically difficult anymore. It was morally repugnant. To publicly dishonor the sole survivor of the Chimera Squadron, a pilot who had already given everything, would be an act of institutional cruelty that would stain them all. The undersecretary closed the file. The meeting's agenda had irrevocably shifted. "General Thornton," he said, his voice now cold and firm. "This story does not get out. The Sundown file is to be resealed. The inquiry into Major Volkov is to be concluded. Find a way to make this entire incident disappear. Quietly. And make sure the word hero is the only one associated with our pilot's actions. Am I clear?" The transmission ended, leaving Thornton alone with the ghost of Anya Volkov's past. His simple solution was in ruins, destroyed by the inconvenient, indestructible truth. The pilot he had intended to crush had from 1,000 miles away defeated him without firing a single shot. His new mission was no longer to find a scapegoat. It was to find a way to bury a legend again. Colonel Matheson had been prepared for a fight. He had spent the days following his insubordinate report to General Thornton, rehearsing his defense, preparing to fall on his sword for his pilot. He expected a furious phone call, a summary dismissal, the ignominious end to a 30-year career. What he received instead was silence, followed by a single, concise, and utterly bewildering communiqué from command headquarters. He read it 3 times in the quiet of his office, the official sterile language a stark contrast to the storm of emotion and politics that had preceded it. The inquiry into the Gray Corridor engagement was officially closed. The findings determined that hostile forces had initiated the ambush and that all actions taken by U.S. Air Force personnel, including Major Anya Volkov, were deemed within acceptable parameters for the defense of squadron assets under duress. A full indefinite media blackout was in effect. All personnel involved were to sign non-disclosure agreements effective immediately. Major Volkov was cleared for full flight duties. That was it. There was no mention of his defiance, no mention of General Evans, no mention of Project Chimera, and his recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross was simply noted as under review, the bureaucratic equivalent of being locked in a vault and buried in the deepest part of the ocean. Matheson leaned back in his chair, a slow, cynical smile touching his lips. He had not won. Truth had not prevailed. A political calculation had been made. They hadn't exonerated Anya out of honor. They had buried the incident out of fear. Fear of a scandal, fear of an old hero's ghost, fear of a story too complicated to be spun. They had chosen not to create a scapegoat, but they had also refused to celebrate a hero. They had simply erased her. It was a victory of a sort, but it tasted of ash. He summoned Anya to his office. When she entered, she moved with the same quiet dignity as before, her face giving nothing away. The last time she had stood on this spot, she was an accused woman. Now she was an absolved one. The change seemed to mean nothing to her. Major Matheson began rising from his chair as a sign of respect. The inquiry is over. You have been formally cleared of any wrongdoing. You are no longer grounded. Your flight status has been fully reinstated. He watched her face closely, expecting some sign of relief, of vindication. He saw nothing. She simply stood there, a statue carved from patience and pain. It was then that he realized that the judgment of his world, of the entire United States Air Force, meant nothing to her. She operated on a different code, answering to a higher, more tragic authority. He decided to step off the official script. Anya, he said, using her first name for the first and only time. Your file, Project Chimera. I read it. For the first time, he saw a flicker of life in her gray eyes, a spark of emotion deep within. What you did out there for Viper's flight was extraordinary, he continued, his voice low and sincere. But what you endured back then, what your squadron went through, you have my deepest and most profound respect, Major. Not just for your skill, but for your courage. It was not the exoneration, but the acknowledgement that finally broke through her armor. It was not a grand emotional explosion, but a quiet internal detonation. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her gaze, for a fraction of a second, lost its focus, looking inward at a wound that had never healed. The respect of a commanding officer for the Spectre, not just the actions of Mama Bear, was the only verdict that had ever mattered. She gave a single, sharp, almost painful nod. It was thanks, acceptance, and dismissal all in one. The flight roster has been updated, Matheson said, returning to a professional tone. You're scheduled for low-level deterrence patrol tomorrow morning. Starty hours. He was offering her a return to normalcy, the quiet, invisible life she had before. But they both knew it was an illusion. The Spectre was awake. The pilots no longer saw a relic. They saw a legend. The hangar was no longer a refuge. It was a shrine. The quiet was gone. Anya looked him in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady for the first time, as if a great weight had finally been settled. Thank you, Colonel, she said, her voice calm and absolute. But I will not be flying tomorrow. My retirement papers were filed 2 months ago. I request you make them effective immediately. Matheson stared at her, a wave of understanding washing over him. He had fought and won a battle to save her career, only to find that she had no intention of keeping it. Her war was over. She had not broken the rules to save her job or to be a hero. She had done it to quiet the ghosts. And now they were quiet. He had saved her from the system. He could not and would not stop her from saving herself. Her quiet retreat from the sky was not a surrender. It was the final triumphant act of a warrior who had finally earned her peace. Colonel Matheson held the pen over Anya Volkov's retirement papers. The request had been flagged, of course. Command had wanted to know why a pilot just cleared of all wrongdoing in a sensitive engagement was suddenly ending her career. Matheson had given them a simple, truthful answer. Her service is complete. He had refused to elaborate, and in the new, cautious political climate surrounding Anya's name, no one had dared to press him. He signed his name. The ink was a dark, final stroke, the bureaucratic seal on the end of an era. With that single motion, Major Anya Spectre Volkov, the last of the Chimera squadron, officially ceased to exist. He felt no triumph, only a profound sense of solemnity. He was not signing off on a retirement. He was authorizing a warrior's well-earned peace. The process of leaving was as quiet and deliberate as Anya herself. She packed the few personal belongings from her quarters into a single duffel bag. Books, a few old photographs, uniforms she would never wear again. Her life, when stripped of the sky, was a Spartan, transient thing. Her final duty was a walk across the base, a silent personal tour of the world she was about to leave behind. She walked past the manicured lawns of the command building, past the noisy mess hall, her presence a ripple of quiet that followed in her wake. As she approached the F-16 hangars, the familiar roar of pre-flight checks filled the air. Viper's squadron was preparing for the afternoon patrol. Lieutenant Masters was the first to see her. He stopped mid-sentence, his hand freezing on a panel of his jet. He straightened up. One by one, the other pilots followed his lead. The chatter and clatter of their work died down. Tools were set aside. They turned to face her as she passed. They did not speak. They did not salute. They simply stood, a silent, green-clad honor guard, their posture a rigid, unspoken testament of their respect. It was not an order from their flight lead. It was a spontaneous, unified gesture from men who understood the debt they owed. Viper stood near the nose of his own aircraft. His eyes met hers across the tarmac. He saw no bitterness in her gaze, no regret, only a vast, calm emptiness. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that transcended rank, a simple acknowledgement from one warrior to another. Anya returned it, a flicker of understanding in her own eyes. It was more than any medal, more meaningful than any parade. It was the only farewell she had ever wanted. Her final stop was Hangar 7. Her Warthog stood in the center of the cavernous space, fully repaired, its scars neatly patched over. It was ready for a new pilot, a new war. The air was still and cool, smelling of home. She was alone. This was the hardest goodbye. She walked around the aircraft, her fingertips brushing against the cool metal skin, a blind woman reading a beloved face. She knew every dent, every rivet, every stain. This machine was the keeper of her secrets, the silent witness to her deepest grief and her greatest triumphs. It was the only thing that had never left her. With a familiar fluid motion, she climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit one last time. The worn seat molded to her form. Her hands rested on the stick and throttle, a perfect final fit. The price of her peace was this, sacrificing the only place in the world where she had ever truly belonged. To leave the sky was to leave the last tangible piece of her brother, the last echo of their shared dream. It was a self-inflicted amputation, cutting away a part of her own soul. She sat there for a long time, bathed in the dim light of the hangar, a captain on the silent bridge of her grounded ship. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the faint layer of dust on her cheek. It was a tear for the boy in the photograph, for the pilots she had lost, and for the woman she would no longer be. Then, with the utmost care, she reached forward and gently peeled the yellowed photograph of Dmitri from the console. The tape left a faint, clean rectangle on the worn panel. She looked at the boy's smiling, gap-toothed face, then slipped the photo into the pocket of her jacket. She had finally brought him home. She climbed out of the cockpit, not looking back. She descended the ladder, her boots hitting the concrete floor with a sound of quiet finality. Anya Volkov walked out of the hangar and into the light of the setting sun, leaving the ghosts and the thunder behind her. She was a solitary figure walking toward the main gate, her shadow stretching long behind her, leaving a world of war for a future she could not yet see. Anya Volkov's departure was as quiet as her presence had always been. There was no ceremony, no farewell dinner, no formal recognition of her final heroic act. She simply left. One day she was a ghost in the machine, and the next she was gone. But a ghost of her stature leaves an echo, and that echo reshaped the world she left behind. Life on the airbase found a new kind of normal. In the F-16 squadron, the change was permanent. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful professionalism. The pilots still flew with immense skill, but the arrogance had been tempered by the memory of their own fragility. They had touched death in the gray corridor, and they now carried the humility of that experience with them on every flight. Viper, now Major Evans, led them. He was a different man, a different kind of commander. His briefings were no longer just about speed and technology. He spoke of the Earth as much as the sky, of using shadows and terrain, of the brutal, unpredictable geometry of a close-in fight. He was teaching lessons that were not in any of the official manuals, lessons learned at the hands of a master. The squadron, once the embodiment of modern air power, was now tempered with an ancient, hard-won wisdom. The A-10s, the flying pigs, were no longer a joke. When one of the Warthogs lumbered into the sky, the F-16 pilots would pause their work. They would watch it climb, not with condescension, but with a silent, grudging respect. They had seen what that machine in the right hands was capable of. It was a symbol of a truth they now understood: the deadliest things in the sky were not always the fastest. Miles away in a small town, nestled in a quiet green valley surrounded by mountains that reminded her of home, a woman with tired eyes and scarred hands worked in her garden. She moved with a deliberate, peaceful rhythm, her world now defined by the turning of the soil and the changing of the seasons. She rarely looked at the sky. She had no need to. She had earned her peace, and her reward was this: a quiet, profound, and absolute anonymity. One afternoon, a small unmarked package arrived at Colonel Matheson's office. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, was a small, exquisitely detailed hand-carved model of an A-10 Warthog. There was no note. None was needed. Matheson placed the model on the corner of his desk. It was not a trophy. It was a monument to a pilot who needed no other. A silent reminder of the day a ghost had risen from the past to remind them all of the true meaning of courage. Years passed. The gray corridor remained a place of tense peace. New jets arrived on the flight line, faster, sleeker, and more lethal than the last. The legend of the pilot they called Mama Bear slowly faded from active conversation, becoming a quiet, unofficial story told by veteran crew chiefs to wide-eyed new arrivals, a cautionary tale about underestimating the old ways. In a state-of-the-art briefing room at the Air Force's top fighter weapons school, Commander Alex Viper Evans stood before the next generation. They were the best of the best young pilots with sharp minds and sharper reflexes, their confidence bordering on the divine. They were just as he had been. He was now a teacher, a mentor respected not for the speed of his flying, but for the depth of his tactical wisdom. He was known for his unconventional scenarios, for his insistence on a humility that many of his students initially found frustrating. On his desk, amidst holographic models of hypersonic fighters and stealth drones, sat a worn, die-cast model of an A-10 Warthog. Its paint was chipped, its gun barrels bent slightly from years of handling. During a break, a young, brilliant pilot, the best in her class, pointed to it. "Commander, She asked, a hint of playful challenge in her voice. Why do you keep that old relic? What possible lesson could a museum piece teach us about the future of air combat? Viper picked up the heavy model, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. He looked at the young woman, and in her eyes he saw his own ghost, the arrogant boy who had mistaken technology for strength. He held the model out for her to see. Never underestimate something, he said. His voice quiet, drawing the attention of the other pilots in the room just because it isn't beautiful. He paused, letting the words settle. All of you will learn to pilot the most advanced weapons ever created. You will become the sharpest spears in the arsenal. But you will not be a true warrior until you understand the profound, unshakable value of an unbreakable shield. He placed the model back on his desk, its ugly, stubborn form a silent challenge to the gleaming, perfect machines of the future that surrounded it. The lesson was over. In a world obsessed with the swift and the new, with the fragile, perfect edge of the blade, where does true strength lie? Is it in the power to strike flawless and unforgiving? Or is it found in the scarred, ugly, and stubborn will to simply endure? And so the story of Anya Volkov, the specter they tried to bury, finds its peace. This was never just a story about airplanes. It was a story about the nature of strength itself. It's a quiet reminder that in a world which celebrates the fast, the new and the loud true value often lies in the slow, the steady, and the silent. The greatest acts of heroism are rarely performed for a crowd. They are born from a promise made to a ghost, a debt paid in a lonely sky. The value of a story like this, we hope, is that it encourages us to look a little closer at the unassuming figures in our own lives. The ones who don't seek the spotlight, but who become the unbreakable shield when everything else falls apart. Our world is full of these unsung heroes and forgotten legends. Their stories are everywhere, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be told. If you believe these quiet corners of courage deserve a voice, and if you want to be part of the next journey we take to find them, then consider joining our community by subscribing. Thank you for sharing this one with us. Until next time, look for the strength that doesn't announce itself.